I think empathy specifically this day in history is super important, just because everything is so charged and empathy is kind of gone. Especially on like social media, anything that has to do with politics, COVID, just everything else that's going on in the world. There's not much empathy going around. And so just having empathy in day-to-day communications, I think, is more important now than ever.
When I think about empathy, what I primarily think about is basically being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, being able to feel what they feel. Yeah, that's probably the simple definition that comes to mind.
I would define empathy as an understanding that one can have of someone else because one has undergone similar life experiences.
I mean, I feel like the best way to describe empathy is to like truly understand where somebody else is at. I guess to walk around in somebody else's shoes, to like put yourself where they are, seeking understanding of where they're at.
The picture that I usually think of when I think of empathy is like someone sitting kind of like curled up crying and someone just sitting with them and kind of crying with them, you know?
I think empathy is probably one of the most human things about us. The fact that, like, even when we were babies, mirroring is like a very huge developmental process of mirroring somebody else's emotions or whatever they're doing with their face. I feel like that's like step one of empathy.
To describe empathy, I would say it's like if you're in a conversation with somebody and they're kind of like pouring out about like a problem or a situation that they're going through, and you just are understanding like what they're going through and like kind of feeling those emotions, whether they're good or bad, with them so that they can just feel like seen and understood.
I think deep listening, where you are just available and open and curious and able to sit with someone where they're at and just listen to them and withhold judgment, sit and listen with a curious mind and heart. I think that can develop an understanding that you might not have innately with a shared experience.
I always think about, and I don't know if it's the right illustration, and so if I confuse empathy and sympathy, that's my fault. But I think about walking around in somebody else's shoes, being in their stuff, and specifically getting out of your comfort or comfort level and having to be with them in something that isn't as comfortable or maybe what you're not used to. And so then because of that, you can identify with them and understand a little more what it's like to walk in their shoes.
Putting myself in somebody else's shoes, I think, is the best way to explain it. To just, if I was in that situation, if I was in that person's shoes, this is how I'd feel. So I don't want them to feel that way. I want to do everything I can to mitigate that or minimize that issue. And so that's kind of what empathy is to me. It's just kind of putting myself in somebody else's shoes.
So I think empathy is primarily other-centered, where if I am feeling empathy for someone, I'm thinking about how they're feeling, how they're affected, and I'm trying to essentially get in their head and understand why they're thinking what they're thinking or how they're feeling what they're feeling, which I think is a little different from sympathy, because I think sympathy is a little bit self-centered in the sense that I feel bad and I'm thinking about how I feel because of that other person's situation, rather than putting myself in their shoes. How do they feel about the situation that they're in?
I feel like, and again, this could be just my lack of understanding a definition, but sympathy for me is maybe more like I'll have feelings, like thoughts about, I'm sympathetic. That's difficult. That's hard. Like, oh, I'm sorry. And empathy feels like you're a little more committed. Like you've got to actually, and I'm going to go and do something and maybe be, so I have no idea if that's correct or not, but that's usually kind of how I've separated. Like I can be sympathetic about somebody in a situation where they don't have as much. And it's like, yeah, that's hard. I think about that, I feel that, and empathy feels like I'm committed maybe a little bit. I got to do something.
Yeah, and I mean, empathizing doesn't just have to be about negative situations, because you can rejoice with those who rejoice or mourn with those who mourn. It can be either. But yeah, I feel like sympathy, at least just for me, is a lot more passive, where I feel like empathy pushes through that apathy to act,
I think of sympathy more as a synonym for pity. I know pity has some negative connotations, but I think it's possible to feel sympathy for someone that you haven't, and feel immediate sympathy for someone that you haven't had a shared experience with.
I could be wrong, but I think that sympathy is just kind of like feeling sorry for somebody. So, I mean, it's being sympathetic, like, oh, I'm sorry this happened. But empathy, I feel, and I think it goes a little deeper, in the sense that you feel sympathy, or you feel for the other person, but empathy makes you do something about it. I want to comfort you. I want to say some words of encouragement, or I want to be able to be generous or give of my time or resources to help the person in that empathy that I have for them.
I think where empathy gets distorted for us is when life hits us in the face, when we start experiencing like the difficulties, the trials, the troubles, and we're almost kind of given this message of, if you don't look out for yourself, you're not going to make it. And so we kind of become like very individualistic and kind of lose that empathetic, natural ability to see other people's crap that they're going through.
And so for me, like this is hard work, because it demands that we have to be with people, but not necessarily like check it off the box where it's just going to be over. And I did my time with that person, and now I understand them and I care about, like, we're also like shallow and not putting in the effort, not putting in the time. And so then nothing changes. We keep getting further apart.
And yeah, like the bummer is, I feel like the way our society is going, we're trending towards that shallow community, that community without empathy. And that's probably because empathy takes so much effort. It really does. It takes a lot of emotional effort. It takes a lot of focus, something that I think that we all really struggle with. It takes a lot of, like, you literally enter into somebody else's experience, which means you could experience pain and other things. And you can experience other people's uncertainty. God forbid. We already have a lot of our own personal uncertainty.
There is a certain level of vulnerability when we're empathetic, because we're opening ourselves up to sometimes situations that we don't even know or understand. Anything can happen, especially when we ask somebody like, "Hey, how are you really doing?" It's just showing empathy, and because a lot of times people just say, "Oh, I'm doing fine," but it's like, "How are you doing?" And that could open up a lot of things that, in the situation, in that instance, I might not know how to respond, or it could be a very emotional thing that the person is going through. So there's a level of vulnerability there, just to kind of step away from my comfort zone and be open to whatever the situation could bring. So
It takes effort on like our end, and it doesn't always turn out the way that you want it to, and so it's like discouraging for people to see that. And so if they've ever experienced that, it's like, okay, well, I'm never gonna do that again.
We choose apathy because empathy is painful. I mean, like I said, I think empathy is a realization that I have suffered and that you have suffered in some way. And a lot of times, diving deep into that suffering and exploring it is scary and painful. And if we can numb that with apathy, that can be a comfortable place to live. I mean, I've experienced that myself, with really exploring the empathy and compassion is difficult and scary, and might lead me to conclude that I need to take action that would be even scarier. And it's easier to just sit back in apathy and kind of numb that.
Empathy requires actually turning away from ourselves and the things that we would think are important, and kind of go and giving this longer commitment to another person. And so that's hard. That's not something we're always ready to give up.
Our egos make it difficult to be empathetic, because when I hear something that puts up my defenses, that defense is there to protect my ego, and to protect my sense of self-worth and my sense of value.
When you have person A and person B, and they're trying to interact with one another, they both have these deeply felt needs, and those things sometimes can feel at odds. I think everybody has this deep desire to be fully known and fully loved and accepted.
It's hard because we all think that our own opinions are the right ones and the only way to go.
There's definitely still plenty of places and again, most of it comes out when I'm on social media and I'm reading the news, and there's these things of oh man, and I get kind of scared, I get kind of freaked out, and then empathy is gone. And I'm not seeing people as people anymore. I'm seeing people as problems that need to be dealt with, right? Because you are coming in the way of my security or how I'm trying to feel safe and feel okay about my life.
Everything's down to a soundbite. Everything's down to, a tweet on Twitter, or a posting and a dislike and a like, and everybody's being summed up and summarized into groups, polar groups. And so nobody's doing the hard work of actually sitting with people, and really thinking about their life, and that nobody can be summed up in one word that they said or one mistake that they made, but we're doing it for sure.
It's hard to change that goal of okay, I'm gonna convince you to let me just understand you, because it's more of a humble standpoint of I understand that everything I say may not be correct.
I think empathy is by its own nature a vulnerable position to put yourself in, because to exercise in empathy, you have to sometimes lay down some of the things that give you personal security.
There's a very dynamic relationship between empathy and vulnerability, because on one hand, empathy empowers vulnerability. When your vulnerability is met with empathy, understanding, stepping into your experience and loving you, it makes you all right, I can continue to be vulnerable. I can continue to be known because I am accepted. And in the same sense, in order to enter into empathy, you have to be known a little bit for someone to empathize with you. And so in searching for that empathetic community, it requires a step of boldness, of actually putting some vulnerability out there to see if people will empathize, will connect, will care, will love.
And it doesn't seem like we're getting closer to caring about each other. It seems like we're getting further apart, and each time we have an election cycle or something, or some story or something more I don't know, that exposes kind of what everybody thinks about a certain issue, it doesn't seem to bring us together. It doesn't cause us to say, I really care about that person and I want to understand their side. It just says, oh, then I'm going further this way, and I'm going to put a couple of layers of protection between me and you and your group and my group.
Nobody wants to admit maybe there is something there that I'm not right about. It's a very humbling kind of experience to do that. And like humility in today's culture is really hard. And I think a lot of people see it as like a sign of weakness, but a lot of times it's actually somebody else like swallowing their pride, which is super hard to do. And so I think that's like a huge strength, but it's super difficult.
And somebody has to be willing to take that kind of position of humility, or kind of take that position of like, I'm going to serve you in this moment and take care of you in this moment and put my needs to the side for a little bit. So I think that's part of the reason why it's so difficult, is because of those really basic needs that we all have and how we try to meet those in other people. So that, I would say that's probably our biggest problem.
Sometimes people can just be so mean to each other, and they just aren't really thinking about that this other person is a person, and it's just like, oh, I'm just stating my opinion and how your opinion is wrong or whatever.
In situations where I know somebody has an opposing opinion of mine and they're like really good at just listening to what I have to say, instead of immediately like interrupting me and being like, okay, but have you thought about it like this? Have you thought about it like this? I just like see like a big amount of humility and vulnerability and empathy when people just listen and like let you talk, and not just like listen so they can respond, but listen so that they can understand.
If we can search for empathy, if we can search for a common ground that can help us feel empathy, it can increase the level of compassion that we use when we communicate with people. I think there's especially right now, kind of in the political climate, there's a lot of conflict that arises from just a lack of listening and a lack of searching to find empathy. I think if you are able to empathize with someone, it immediately brings you to a place of soft-heartedness. You stop trying to defend yourself, you stop trying to attack the other person, and you instead feel compassion. I mean, I think the word compassion itself is really kind of a companion word to empathy, because compassion means literally to suffer with.
I think in a lot of cases, people that are not empathetic, a lot of times they just look at the facts of the situation and they're very kind of like black and white, like if this is what's going on, or this doesn't affect me, so I don't feel any empathy. But in a basic sense, it's just trying to help the person understand, like, okay, how would you feel if that was you? Or how would you feel if that was somebody that you love or somebody in your family? Would you feel different about this situation? Or would you feel more empathy for this person?
Getting people's perspectives on everything, as long as they're different than yours, it's amazing. Like, I think everybody should do it.
Teaching somebody has to first tap into those core beliefs and values, and maybe finding those things that kind of push and challenge us a little bit beyond our own comfort, because you have to go past self. You have to go past the self thing. And so then I think there's also just to put your money where your mouth is and actually do something. And I am just a proponent of leading by doing something and inviting people to do it with me. I know that's how I learned. That's how I was compelled. I watched my wife, be very generous, and my wife was the one who taught me about the importance of giving.
To teach somebody to be more empathetic would just be like thinking of being in that person's shoes. Like when you're in a conversation with somebody and you feel like that other person is just not really like listening to you, or like being very kind with what they're saying to you because you have like an opposing opinion, then that's like a time to think, okay, like if I were in their shoes, like how would I want to be treated? How would I want them to talk to me and to like relate to me, rather than like being super defensive, just being like, okay, I may not agree, but I'm gonna try and understand you because I know you come from like a different context or situation or background. And so I want to try and understand you, and I know there's something there that I can relate with. I just need to try a little bit harder to do that with you.
So I guess if I'm trying to explain or help somebody understand how to be a little more empathetic, I think it does start with just a practice of talking through, all right, let's think about the situation that this other person is in. And if you were in that same situation, how would you feel if you were in their shoes? And just have a little bit of a dialogue about that, allow somebody to just explore what that might feel like. And I think part of the difficulty with empathy is it's never perfect. You can never fully understand somebody else's inner world.
Being an example of empathy is definitely the number one. And then one-on-one conversations with people is number two, where you are asking questions, like those probing questions that make people think deeper and I've definitely had those conversations with people, or people have had those conversations with me, like where I get super frustrated with this and somebody is like, okay, well, what are they going through? Like, what's going on in their life? Are they hiding something? Are they whatever? And like that definitely makes you stop and think. And like that's like those conversations have like definitely changed how I interact with people.
Just that state of mindfulness is something I try to foster in my children, so that they can be mindful in places where they could practice more empathy.
It's a hard thing to teach. Like, I don't think I could go up to somebody and say, hey, I'm going to teach you empathy or whatever. Like, ultimately it is up to that person. And I do think it is like a deeper heart thing.
I think the best way to do it is just start, or like the best way to teach it is by doing it and letting other people recognize, like, hey, they treat me a little bit differently when I come to them with this or this or this. And it makes me feel like good and safe. And I know, like, with these other people, I don't feel safe. But maybe if I tried doing what they're doing with them, I would feel like they would feel okay and we could have a better relationship. So I feel like the best teacher would just be by like exercising it in our own life.
I don't like it when I get angry at a specific person for the way that they're doing things. Like, I want to be empathetic. I want to understand where they're coming from. And so talking about it with other people, like working through it, is a good thing. Like,
I have been deeply impacted by the empathy of others. And in seeing that, I recognize that is the way. That is what I want to do because it has been done to me. And so I think the best way to teach it is to just demonstrate it.
I want those things, but I would say like I fight it at a personal level with my relationship with God, and then in my role as a pastor, like I want to model that, and I want us to grow in that, not just to check it off, to say we did it and we were empathetic. Because I think that's probably a misnomer. I don't think you can just say I checked off being empathetic. Like, I think it's going to be a lifelong commitment. And so I want those things, but I also feel like there's this tug of war in my heart too, of I'm not just going to give the like world peace, like I know that there's a struggle as I think through wanting those things and what that really means.
Just like hearing people who I know and I trust and I know that they really love Jesus, when I hear them be empathetic towards like these people, it's just like, oh, okay, like you're right. And it kind of gives me like this moment of like my head is above water, like I'm not so angry, I'm not so bitter all the time. And it's just like, yeah, these people are just like me.
You could still disagree with somebody, but still exercise a ton of empathy, which I think leads to like really practical, really practical things. Because when you're empathizing with somebody else, you're focused on them, you're focused on how they would feel, and you're able to think about in this situation or in this interaction, if I was in their shoes, which I'm actively thinking about that, being in their shoes, if I was in their shoes, how would I want to be interacted with in this moment? I think it just creates an incredible incredible environment for essentially like a loving and other-centered kind of interaction between people.
I think there's this longing in us to find that true source of empathy. And so for me, it may not be an encouragement, but it would definitely be an exhortation to say that even if like somebody thinks the church or Christianity has just so blown it and it's just so not even worth being listened to. But I would say that Jesus himself, the one who did display that perfect empathy, is worth listening to once more, considering once more. And I think, that's where my hope is. That's the only thing I have. Like, I'm not at all hoping in my ability or the ability of human beings to get there and to solve this issue. Like, so somebody may say, well, that's convenient. That's convenient for you as a Christian, and that's why we reject it, because you're not going to do the hard work. And so I'm not saying to like that here's just the rubber stamp, but I am saying that the only place where I've found even the motivation to consider doing this, to consider loving people well and putting myself in their shoes, would be the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so, I don't know, that would be my thing, I would say.
My guess is there are probably going to be some people that totally disagree with what I'm about to say. But for me, where my motivation comes from for empathy is 100% from my faith and my relationship with Jesus. Because empathy is really hard. It takes a lot of endurance, and it's not just like, you don't just make a choice, like, okay, from now on I'm going to be empathetic. That can be a good resolution, but then every moment that presents itself for you to be empathetic, you need to make that decision again, that I'm again going to choose to be empathetic now. And it's especially hard when people continue to not reciprocate that. And so for me, the motivation comes from the fact that what I believe about how Jesus has interacted with me is with so much compassion, so much mercy, and so much empathy. Like, Jesus had just poured out incredible love over my life and into my life that I could never deserve. And so when I think about the fact that, I've been talking about people's feelings of self-protection and the need that they have to be fully known and fully loved. Well, I truly believe that my need to be fully known and fully loved is 100% met in Jesus. That nobody knows me better than Jesus does. Like, he's God. He made me. He created me. And so he literally knows everything about me better than I know about myself. And the Bible says that he loves me. And so if the God of the universe, who knows me better than anybody else, loves me, then that means that I have no need anymore. My need has been met in that relationship. And so in every other relationship in my life, and that includes my wife, that includes my kids, that includes my good friends and random strangers, okay, all of these other people, they do not have to meet my need for love anymore. They don't have to accept me. I don't need them to. And I can still, I would like them to still, that would be great. But if they don't, I still have been so well loved, so completely loved, and that I can continue to extend that to other people.
Primarily because of my spiritual and eternal beliefs, I am so compelled to help other people experience relationship with God and to experience the subsequent empathy from that. That's where my empathy comes from. That's where my daily, every morning when I wake up tired, my experience of empathy from God is what drives me to continue to give it. But ultimately, if we just break it down really small, it's just seeing people grow past what they never thought they could. And that is worth it to me, because that experience for me, growing past something I never thought I would, and seeing that happen over and over and over again, and being like, wow, this is amazing. That's kind of what keeps me going with it. I have that hope for others.
Oh man. I don't think people understand how much better it could be. Like how much better our conversations could be. Even with things where they're like, don't talk about it. Like religion, politics, whatever, like all these things that it's like, don't talk about those things. I don't think people understand how much better it can be.
If somebody is willing to bear your burdens with you or to join you where you're at, it just adds dignity to your life. And it adds value and worth, and it speaks to your worth as a being, like as an individual. And I think that's something that everybody craves. They crave value, they crave that dignity. And so when somebody is willing to meet you specifically where you're at, in your situation that is completely untethered to others, if they're willing to recognize that and say, hey, it is worth stepping into that situation, getting in the mud with somebody, that adds value to someone's life.
When we understand, we see the benefits of empathy and how it brings comfort and peace to others. I think that's something that we all want.
Yeah, it just helps you grow as a person, which I think is, I feel like everybody needs to grow. So why not?
It's incredible what happens to an individual when they experience those things, value, and when they believe about themselves that they have worth and dignity. It's crazy what that unlocks in an individual. And so if we extrapolated that across everybody or just our community even, that's really cool. Because people would be trading in value and worth and dignity essentially in their interactions.
I think if everybody had an average amount of empathy, the world would be a better place, for sure.
Yeah, there would be no hunger. There would be widespread sharing of what we have with others who don't have it. Yeah, it's very hard to imagine such a world because, and I am a participant in it, of the world the way that things are. So it's hard to imagine a fully whole world in that sense. But yeah, I think so many of the, global issues, the global crises that we face right now, a lot of that has a root in just a lack of empathy, potentially.
I think that when it comes to empathy, everybody wants everybody else to be empathetic, right? Like everybody, it's like I want everybody else to show me empathy. But again, when we think about the fact that showing empathy is an act of courage, it's an act of vulnerability, like somebody has to be willing to go first, and I can't make anybody else go first.
I think it definitely benefits all of us. I think when we're more empathetic, when as a society we move to loving our neighbors like we love ourselves.
Like, yes, it adds value to my life and it has deeply impacted me, but also like I have a call on my life to be empathetic that I think is higher than me, that ultimately I know that Jesus is the ultimate empathizer, the ultimate one who gets down in our mess for no reason other than he chose to. That's just an act of love. And so that love that adds value to my life is so compelling every day that I'm compelled to follow it. And it's kind of cool in a sense because I know that that's spiritual, but it so deeply reflects our secular, personal, individual, like psychological, biological experience that like we all crave value and we all crave worth and we all crave that somebody cares about us.
I want to continue to grow, to have that be my first response always. because it's not always like it often is like a struggle or a little bit of a fight to get there, and to remember, like, you know what, I need to actually see this person as a person, and try to understand, or see this group of people as people and try to understand.
I think it takes courage to explore where we might be able to well up more compassion.
You know what? Like, I want more of this to be spread around, so it kind of has to start with me.
And that's how I'm going to practice empathy today in every opportunity that I can, hopefully.